The early morning mist hung over the fields of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Rebecca Stoltzfus, 18 years old, was already awake and making bread. Her fingers worked the dough the same way her mother and grandmother had taught her. Rebecca's community, the Old Order Amish, lived differently than most people. They didn't have electricity, cars, or phones. They used horse-drawn buggies to get around, oil lamps for light, and talked to each other face-to-face instead of through devices. The Amish chose this simple life because of their faith. They believed in Gelassenheit, the idea of yielding to God's will, living simply, and staying humble. Their faith was part of everything they did, from the plain clothes they wore to the Pennsylvania Dutch language they spoke with each other. About 30 families made up their district. Twice a month, they gathered in different homes for a Sunday meeting. They sang from the Ausbund, their old hymnal, and listened to sermons from ministers chosen from among them. These gatherings brought everyone together, not just for worship but also to strengthen their bonds as a community. For young people like Rebecca, finding someone to marry meant finding the right balance between what they wanted and what the community expected. The Amish didn't date like the English, their word for non-Amish people. Courtship was serious and always aimed toward marriage and starting a family rooted in faith. Rebecca had been to many weddings, simple ceremonies in homes, followed by big meals where everyone celebrated together. She had seen many young couples start their lives together, often in small houses attached to family homes before building their own. At 18, Rebecca was old enough to marry, but she hadn't felt drawn to any of the young men in her district. As she put her bread in the wood-burning oven, she wondered if God had someone in mind for her. Little did she know that he did, and that person was just a few farms away. Jacob Miller wiped sweat from his forehead as he guided his horses through the field. At 22, he knew farming well, having learned everything from his father and grandfather. His family had moved to Lancaster County from Ohio 3 years ago, looking for better farmland. Moving hadn't been easy. All Amish communities shared the same big beliefs, but each district had its own ordnung, unwritten rules about daily life. In Ohio, they couldn't use rubber tires on farm equipment. Here, they could. Small differences like this took time to get used to. The Yoder family needed a new barn, and everyone would help build it. Barn raisings were important in Amish life. When someone needed a new barn, everyone came together and built it in one day. Men and boys did the building while women and girls made food to feed everyone. On the day of the barn raising, Jacob arrived early with his father and brothers, bringing their tools. By mid-morning, the barn frame was taking shape, with dozens of men working together. At lunchtime, Jacob got in line for food at the long tables set up under trees. That's when he saw her, a young woman with kind brown eyes, serving fresh bread that steamed in the cool air. Unlike other young women who giggled and looked at the unmarried men, she worked quietly and gracefully. "You're new," she said when he reached her, giving him a warm slice of bread. "Not so new anymore," Jacob replied with a small smile. "Been here for 3 years now. I'm Jacob Miller." She looked at him briefly, then smiled. "I'm Rebecca Stoltzfus." It wasn't a long talk, but Jacob couldn't stop thinking about Rebecca all afternoon. What he felt wasn't like the love at first sight you hear about in English stories. It was more like a feeling that here was someone he wanted to know better. Amish young people didn't go on private dates. Instead, they got to know each other at group activities, youth gatherings called singings, work events, and Sunday meetings. The next singing was on Sunday evening, and Jacob was really looking forward to it. Rebecca found herself thinking about the quiet young man with the steady eyes, too. She had noticed that he worked differently than local boys. The way he handled his horses showed he'd learned elsewhere. His Pennsylvania Dutch had a different accent, too. These differences made her curious about him. At the singing, young people gathered after the evening meal at someone's home. They sang for hours, then shared snacks and talked. Many Amish couples first got to know each other at these gatherings, always with others around. When Jacob arrived with his younger brother, Rebecca was already there with two friends. Their eyes met across the room, and they both smiled a little. Later, as everyone was getting ready to leave, Jacob found himself standing near her. "Your bread was the best I've ever tasted," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied. "My grandmother's recipe. I hope to try it again sometime," he told her. It wasn't much, but it was a start, one that respected both their feelings and their traditions. Over the next months, Jacob and Rebecca saw each other at Sunday meetings and community events. They talked more in group settings. Jacob helped when Rebecca's family needed help with planting, and Rebecca sent food for Jacob's family when his mother got sick. People noticed their interest in each other. Rebecca's father watched Jacob during work events, seeing that he worked hard and respected others. Jacob's mother invited Rebecca to help with quilting, using the time to see if she was good at homemaking. This community involvement in young relationships wasn't nosy, it was protective, making sure young people made good choices for lifelong marriages. After several months, Jacob asked Rebecca if he could take her home from a singing in his buggy. This was a big step, it showed he was serious about her. That first buggy ride alone together was both exciting and awkward. Their buggy followed others leaving the gathering, lanterns swinging from the corners, horse hooves making a steady clip-clop sound on the road. "I've been wanting to do this for a while," Jacob said, speaking softly. "I've been hoping you would," Rebecca answered honestly. That night, they talked about their families, about differences between Ohio and Pennsylvania Amish ways, and about what they wanted for the future. Both wanted a farm, children, and a life centered on faith. These shared hopes formed the foundation of their growing bond. Amish courtship usually happened in secret, not because it was wrong, but because it was private. Couples didn't show affection in public, and even in private, they only held hands until marriage. This helped them focus on talking, shared values, and spiritual connection rather than just physical attraction. When Jacob started coming to the Stoltzfus farm on Sunday evenings to visit Rebecca, everyone knew what it meant, but they didn't talk about it openly. He would come after dinner, spend a few hours with her in the family's front room, always with family nearby, and leave by 9 o'clock. These visits, called sitting up, let them get to know each other better. During one such evening, while Rebecca's younger brothers and sisters played a board game nearby and her parents did household accounts at the kitchen table, Jacob brought up something important. "My grandfather left me some land," he said quietly. "On the north edge of our property. My father says I could build there, if I had a reason to." Rebecca stopped mending the shirt in her lap. "Would you want to build there?" she asked. "I would," he answered, looking into her eyes. "With the right partner." It wasn't exactly a proposal, but it clearly showed his intentions, giving her time to think about a future together. Their relationship faced challenges beyond just getting to know each other. Jacob's family, while Amish, followed slightly different traditions. His mother's family came from a more progressive settlement where women's prayer caps were smaller and certain battery-powered tools were allowed for business. These differences sometimes caused tension. When Jacob mentioned that his family used a gas-powered water pump instead of the hand pump Rebecca's family used, her brother made a comment about modern Amish that hurt Jacob's feelings. Sometimes Rebecca defended her district's more conservative ways. "We've kept more of the old ways, and I think that's important," she told Jacob during one tense conversation. "Sometimes new ways can be good too, when they don't hurt our faith," he replied. These talks made them both think about what really mattered in being Amish, not just the rules, but the deeper beliefs about faith, community, and staying separate from worldly influences. Through these discussions, they grew closer, building respect and shared purpose. After 8 months of courtship, as they sat on the porch swing at Rebecca's home watching a beautiful sunset, Jacob took her hand and asked simply, "Would you build a life with me, Rebecca? As my wife?" Her yes was just as simple, but full of certainty. They would get married in November, after harvest, a traditional time for Amish weddings when the community had time for celebration. The wedding took place on a Tuesday in late November. Unlike fancy English weddings with white dresses and expensive parties, Amish weddings focused on the promise being made and the community watching it. Rebecca wore a new blue dress she had sewn herself, not white, which would be impractical to wear again, but blue that she could wear to Sunday meetings for years to come. Over it, she wore a white apron showing purity, and her prayer covering was new too. Jacob wore a black suit with a vest, more formal than his work clothes, but still plain and modest. The ceremony lasted nearly 3 hours, held in the Stoltzfus barn, which had been cleaned thoroughly and set up with benches. The bishop performed the ceremony in Pennsylvania Dutch, reminding everyone about marriage duties and what the Bible says about husbands and wives. They didn't exchange rings. The Amish thought rings were unnecessary decoration, but their promises were binding before God and the community. Afterward, everyone shared a meal prepared by the women. Tables were loaded with chicken, roast beef, mashed potatoes, gravy, bread, vegetables from fall harvests, and many pies. The celebration continued into the evening, though without music or dancing, which weren't allowed in their district. That night, Rebecca moved her few belongings, clothes, some quilts she had made, personal items, to the small house Jacob had built on his family's land. It was simple by English standards, just a few rooms with a kitchen, living area, bedroom, and bathroom. But to Rebecca, it was perfect, their own home, the beginning of their life together. The early months of marriage brought changes, as they do for all couples. Rebecca had to learn what foods Jacob liked and when he liked to do things, while Jacob had to get used to sharing space after years of having his own room in his parents' home. They worked through these adjustments practically, focusing on fixing problems rather than complaining about them. Their first big challenge came in spring planting. A late frost threatened the crops Jacob had carefully planted, and they worked all night covering plants to protect them. As the sun rose after their exhausting work, Rebecca said, "I never really understood before why my father always said farming shows our faith." Jacob looked at her, his tired face softening. "Every seed we plant is a prayer," he agreed. In moments like these, their marriage grew deeper than romance into something more lasting, a shared purpose that matched their faith and values. As their first anniversary approached, Rebecca and Jacob had hoped to be expecting a child by now. In the Amish community, children were seen as blessings from God, and large families were common. Many couples welcomed their first baby within a year of marriage. But month after month, no baby came. At first, they didn't speak of it much. God's timing, Jacob would say gently when Rebecca's monthly disappointment came. But as time passed, Rebecca grew quieter, her usual cheerful spirit dimming. She noticed the glances at community gatherings, the whispers that stopped when she approached. Most painful were the well-meaning questions from her mother and sisters, "Any news yet?" Rebecca tried to keep her faith strong. Each night, she prayed for a child, and each month when her hopes were dashed, she tried to accept it as God's will. But doubt began to creep in. Why wasn't God answering their prayers? What was wrong with her? Jacob saw her pain, though she tried to hide it. He noticed how she would turn away when young mothers brought their babies to Sunday meeting. He saw how she would hold her sister's new baby with both joy and deep sadness in her eyes. He watched as she grew quieter in prayer, as if unsure God was listening. One morning in early spring, Jacob woke before dawn. He knelt beside their bed and prayed longer than usual, asking God for guidance. Then he went to their small garden where the first flowers were beginning to bloom. He carefully cut 2 blooms, a pink rose and a tiny white daisy. He placed them in a small jar by Rebecca's breakfast plate with a simple note, "One for you, one for the child God will bless us with." When Rebecca found the flowers, tears filled her eyes. Such a simple gesture, but it touched her deeply. Jacob didn't say if they had a child, but when his faith was that strong. The next morning, there were 2 flowers again. And the next after that. Each morning as spring turned to summer, Jacob left 2 flowers for her. Some days, when their garden had little to offer, he would walk to the meadow beyond their property to find wildflowers. But he never missed a day. The 2 flowers became his silent promise, a daily reminder of his faith that God would answer their prayers. The whispers in the community continued. Rebecca overheard an older woman at a quilting gathering say, "Perhaps they're being punished for some reason." The words stung like nettles. That night, she cried in Jacob's arms. "God doesn't work that way," Jacob said firmly, holding her close. "He doesn't punish with withholding children. His timing isn't our timing." "But what if I can never have children?" Rebecca whispered her deepest fear. "Then we will find other ways to fill our home with love," Jacob answered. "But I believe, Rebecca. I believe and I know God hears us." Rebecca began to look forward to the flowers each morning. They reminded her that even when she couldn't feel God's presence strongly, Jacob's faith was steady, like a rock she could lean on. The flowers became their private language of hope. As summer turned to fall, Rebecca started feeling different. At first, she was afraid to hope, but when she missed her monthly time, a spark of joy lit inside her. She waited another week before telling Jacob, afraid the disappointment would be too great if she was wrong. One crisp fall morning, after Jacob left for the fields, Rebecca went to their garden. With trembling hands and a heart full of gratitude, she selected 3 flowers, a red rose, a yellow marigold, and a sturdy purple bachelor's button. When Jacob came home that evening, tired from a long day of work, he found the 3 flowers placed carefully on the bench where he always set his tools. His eyes questioned her as he came inside, holding the flowers gently. "One for you," she said, touching the purple flower. "One for me." She touched the red rose. Her hand rested on the yellow marigold as happy tears filled her eyes. "And one for our baby." Jacob stood frozen for a moment, hardly daring to believe. "Rebecca? Are you?" She nodded, her face glowing. "Yes. The baby we've been praying for is coming." Jacob let out a joyful laugh, lifting Rebecca and spinning her around gently before setting her down with sudden care, as if she might break. He dropped to his knees, pressing his face against her still flat stomach, his shoulders shaking with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, and Rebecca knew he was speaking to God as much as to her. That night, they prayed together with renewed faith, thanking God for the precious gift growing inside her. Rebecca felt a peace she hadn't known in months. The waiting had been painful, but somehow it made this joy even deeper. The next morning, Rebecca woke to find 3 flowers by her bedside, a purple bachelor's button, a red rose, and a tiny white daisy. Jacob had placed them there before dawn. "One for me," he said, touching the purple flower when he saw she was awake. "One for you." He touched the red rose. "And one for our child." His finger gently brushed the white daisy. "God sees us all." From that day on, their morning flower ritual continued with the 3 flowers. Sometimes Rebecca would leave them for Jacob to find, sometimes he would leave them for her. On Sundays, they would place all 3 together on their table as a reminder of God's faithfulness during family prayers. As her pregnancy progressed, they faced the usual decisions all Amish couples did about birth. Most Amish women used midwives, but some went to hospitals for difficult births. For Rebecca and Jacob, after their long wait for this child, they decided to use both, an experienced Amish midwife who had delivered hundreds of babies, but with the English doctor in town aware in case help was needed. "Our ways are good," Jacob said during their discussion. "But sometimes God provides help through the English doctors too, if needed." Rebecca nodded, drawing strength from his balanced view. My mother says what matters most is that we receive all help with thankfulness to God, not to man. On a cold December night, their son Samuel was born in their own home with the midwife's help, healthy and strong with a good set of lungs. As Jacob held his son for the first time, wrapped in a simple white blanket made by Rebekah's mother, he whispered a prayer of thanks. The next morning, Rebekah woke to find 3 flowers by her bedside. Jacob had searched far and wide in the winter landscape to find them. "One for you," he said, touching each flower in turn. "One for me. And one for Samuel. God has seen us all." If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future content. For more Amish romance books, cozy mysteries, and cookbooks, visit SamanthaPriceAuthor.com.